recommend Giovanni to get a Nobel Prize.
A Nobel Prize.
Yeah, we should recommend you.
Because he's
If you're
always
retired
right.
now.
Well, he's always right, but he also always thinks anyone else who's right should have cited him.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, if you look at the ratio between my on repack, but my downloads versus my citation, it means that a lot of people download me to use the paper doing for something else, for some other purpose, or they copy it, one of the two.
You're a public knowledge repository, Giovanni.
I'm a public knowledge. Well, generally, public knowledge are cited.
Nandita, I think it is time we
Okay.
start.
Yep. So let's start and bring in some discipline, as Rajesh was saying before. So hello, everyone. This is the second event in the In Conversation series organized by the CRIS Network and UNU Merit, the United Nations University. So the Chris Freeman Centenary Lecture Series was started last year in the birth of his, in the year of his birth centenary. The initiative was started by a few alumni of GlobalX. Each event in this In Conversation series featured the work of a scholar, her contributions to the field, the relevance of her works in the light of the challenges we face now, like the pandemic or the climate change. So today here we are featuring Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who will engage in a discussion with Professor Giovanni Dosi. So let me take the opportunity to thank many of you here who helped in structuring the series. I begin to start thanking Bente Lundwall, Ned Lawrence, Alan Freeman, Luke Sood, Carlotta Perez, and Mamo Mucci. Thanks also to the core committee members, Rajesh, Sean, Veronica, Swati, and Indu for their hard work to help realize this. So the format will be the following. After the conversation between Giovanni and Mariana, we'll take a quick break of 5 minutes, and then we'll pass the floor to the panel members who will pose their questions to Mariana. So today we have 3 panel members, Luke Sood, Maria Savona, and Carlotta Perez. Many thanks also to the 3 of you. After the questions from the panel, we'll have Q&A from the floor. So before I hand over to Giovanni, who will speak a few words about Mariana, let me quickly introduce Giovanni. So true that today we have 2 people who don't need an introduction, especially to this crowd. But for those who don't know, Giovanni Dosi is a professor at the Institute of Economics at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa. He is editor of the journal Industrial and Corporate Change. He is included in the ISI highly cited research list of those who made fundamental contributions to the advancement of science and technology. In 2016, he received the Tim Distinguished Scholar Award by the American Academy of Management. He was recently selected as a member of the Academia Europea. Congratulations on this recent achievement from my side and from the side of Press Network. So I give the floor to Giovanni.
I'll be extremely brief because I want to hear the thoughts of Mariana. I mean, Mariana is one of the few people in our community that is able to relate the analytical historical advancement with policy recipes. One can have a discussion on how one does it, but we shall enter into that in the discussion. But one of the fears that Mariana I'm sure will underline is that our community might become politically irrelevant. And Mariana is one of the few people. I mean, I partly put in myself, but in a very, very partial way. But most of us are strikingly absent from the major policy debates. And I think that this occasion can be a chance of understanding why and what we can do about it. Well, there is also Luc among the discussants, so it'd be an interesting conversation on this point. This is also the occasion, I think, to reflect on the relationship between evolutionary economics in general, the economics of innovation, and say the broader political economy view. Having said that, I think I leave the floor to Mariana, and I will come back on the remark that Mariana is going to make.
Good. So thank you so much. Let me know if you stop hearing me, because as I mentioned, I have terrible Wi-Fi in this new home I've just spent too much money on. And so first of all, it's a real honor to be here, both because Chris Freeman for me is a huge inspiration, but also because Giovanni Dosi, who should put his thing on mute, Giovanni, mettiti su muto, is not only a friend, a colleague, but also someone who I've been very, very honest with over the years. We have a love-hate relationship, more love than hate, but we have always been also a thorn in each other's side, which is, I think, always the recipe for a healthy relationship. And the reason, Chris is such an inspiration, was an inspiration. And unfortunately, unlike many people on the screen, I just didn't have a deal. Okay. Someone needs to put on mute. Someone who's got some relative yelling at them. Luckily, it's not mine. They will all soon come home. Anyway, so is that Chris, for me, really represented something very similar, actually, to what Eric Hobsbawm represents for me, which is that very rare ability to both see the world with a theory of change while not getting overly deterministic about thinking that you can put all the details in that theory, but also not getting lost in the details, right? So actually having a real lens on capitalism in particular, and actually having a theory about capitalism, while also enjoying the details. Eric Hobsbawm, as some might know, actually also reviewed jazz and also had a real, I think, love of life because of his work with an interest in politics and in trade unions, for example. And I think Chris was so similar, and there's so few people that I can even name that have that equal ability. And Chris, of course, we've all read his books, and he, and of course, and Carlota Perez, who's his longtime a companion and colleague, both, I think, fit into that, having a theory of change, but also an understanding and respect for the details and the joy of life, while also being actually really politically committed, and politically also in that Aristotelian sense and beyond, and being what I would call a real progressive. And I kind of wanted to begin. I have kind of three big buckets of things I'm going to say, and I was told I could have 20 minutes, but I'll try to reduce it to maybe 15 just to start some of this conversation. Even 10 is fine. So three buckets are, first, what kind of, because this is supposed to be semi-biographical, which it's always nice to do because none of us usually do this, right? We're always talking about the outside, but actually thinking, why do I, how did I get to where I am in terms of some of the thought processes is a useful exercise for anyone. And for me, what was very interesting is that when I was an undergraduate at Tufts University, I was really struck by how many people that I would call progressive, kind of center left, were always worried about the world. At the time it was apartheid, it was the times of civil war in South America and Central America and specifically. So there was the Contras and Sandinistas. And what really struck me was that none of these progressives actually were kind of locally positioned with a critique of our own city, which was Boston. And the way that I kind of learned about Boston, where I was doing this undergraduate degree in history with a minor in economics. Later, I did a master's and PhD in economics, took hundreds of exams in economics, but my grounding in academia was more history. I realized that I just didn't understand the local community because all of our eyes were, again, very far away on the global problems. And for me, to get grounded was getting involved with local trade unions. And as you know, Europeans know, trade unions in Europe are kind of your natural right to organize. In America, it's basically guerrilla warfare. In many companies, if you do try to organize a union, you're fired just because you attempt to organize. And so it was really kind of a human right to have labor represented and to be able to negotiate, using some old words, with capital. But that work I started doing, which then I continued even during my PhD when I was doing research on the American trade unions, in particular the Clothing and Textile Workers Union, which at the time was Act Two, later became Unite in New York, really grounded me on production. I just realized how little I knew about production and in particular innovation, because lots of what was happening and still is happening, of course, is mechanization of production and workers having to kind of defend, or trade unions having to defend against that versus being a proactive voice in kind of the future of the design of production and the capitalist system itself, which I also think is a problem today with climate change, where trade unions on the back of the just transition movement, very important, people like Sharon Barrows, are kind of on the back end of the whole climate battle, just kind of saying, oh, well, make sure workers don't get screwed along the way. We need to invest in, people's abilities to adapt and to move to different types of sectors or be part of the transformation of those sectors, but those voices are not at the table. The labor voice is not at the table ex ante to even define these transitions, for example, the Green Deal or the climate battle. So I became very interested both in the kind of social and economic issues around production, innovation, but also whose voices were at the table in terms of actually the steering of this critical issue. And one of the best classes I took at Tufts was by Philip Murawski, who exposed me to the kind of different theories of economic thought. And it was on the back of his course that I decided then to do a PhD at the New School for Social Research, which continues to be a bit less so than when I was very lucky to be there, but continues to be one of the few places in the world where you're exposed to different theories about capitalism, different theories of value, not just in terms of the history of economic thought. That's easy, right? Keynes once said this, Ricardo said that, Marx said this, but the illumination of the real economics is neoclassical theory. That's how usually history of economic thought gets done at the New School, also places like UMass Amherst and so on. There's actually proper analytical training, both on the quantitative and the qualitative on different theories, post-Keynesian, neo-Ricardian, Marxian, and also neoclassical. And so that for me was very important. And the reason I went to the New School was because through that work with the trade unions, I realized just how little I understood about the economy and specifically production, got very interested in innovation. And then of course, Marx. As we all know, people who've read Marx know that most of what Schumpeter said, Marx already said on innovation. What Schumpeter was very new on, his unique theory had actually more to do with competition. And this is something we might come back to, which is his whole idea that actually innovation, which is a key driver in capitalism of growth, which again, Marx said already, even better in some ways than he did. And then isn't it crazy that we have a theory of competition or a benchmark theory of perfect competition, where to even introduce innovation, you have to introduce imperfect competition. So we all know that there's no perfect competition, but the fact that the benchmark to even talk about reality, whether it's monopoly, oligopoly, and so on, is this kind of bullshit theory of competition, where to even introduce innovation, you have to talk about imperfections, already tells you we have a very problematic theory based on that. And then all the things that come from that, from differentiation between firms, which we evolutionary scholars look a lot at. That's not a transient state towards some sort of competitive equilibria. That's a permanent feature of the system. And understanding that correlation between those processes that create those differences and the kind of winnowing forces that only allow some to survive and grow is, of course, the key of the key seed of evolutionary economic thought. But for me, it was very important to first read Marx properly, Marx volume 1, 2, and 3, various times, to really kind of get a lot of that understanding, even of those differences, those issues around profit rates, those interesting issues around competition, intra-industry differences, but inter-industry, tendential equilibration of profit rates, all these things that people like Duncan Foley and others have also contributed to. I'm going to kind of skip over the kind of sprue period, which for me was very important. And of course, I was so honored to have Chris Freeman's chair, the R.M. Phillips professor. I'm not sure why they still call it that. They should call it the Chris Freeman chair. Please, someone do something about that. But I'll just say that the reason I then became very interested in the role of the state, kind of jumping very quickly forwards, is that not only do I think our own community has not said enough about the state in the process of innovation and competition, but has kind of bought into this idea that the role of the state is to fix different types of failures. Of course, neoclassicals talk about it as fixing market failures, but in some ways, I would argue that the systems of innovation approach and those who've kind of followed that, unfortunately, haven't really replaced that kind of market failure theory. It's still seen as kind of fixing different types of system failures, which are more interesting than market failures. But this idea, which I'm very passionate about, that we need a true alternative instead of fixing market failures and market failure a theory, something that's much more about the co-shaping and co-creation of markets, and really understanding that, for example, with the pillars of people like Carl Polanyi and others who really, contributed so much to understanding of the economy as an outcome of, key drivers, including state activity, which Polanyi said the free market itself would never have existed without the constant kind of oversight and pushing from state actors themselves. That for me not only became interesting, but on the back of the financial crisis, where there was all this austerity globally, but especially in Europe. Let's remember, Europe was particularly foolish. A lot of that austerity was being done in the name of innovation, in the name of competition. And so for me, it became this kind of urgent thing too, to write in that moment where all these cuts were being made, also at our local communities. There was mental health programs and health services being cut in the name of, getting the system to be more flexible and competitive and so on, not just the kind of, wider national kinds of funding pots. I wrote The Entrepreneurial State to kind of question these really kind of bogus assumptions of not only the role of the state and all the things we're interested in, but really in creating more dynamic, innovative, competitive economy. And it was, and ended up being very important for me also to do that kind of research, because I don't think many of us are trained really to properly look at the degree to which the form of the state actor really matters, right? Is it just, again, fixing market failures, or do we actually have a mission-oriented institution? And I'm going to get to the issue of missions and why I set up the institute in just a second, and I'll finish. I'll just need about maybe 5 minutes max. For me, what became very interesting in writing The Entrepreneurial State was that it was not so much a normative point. It was more like, in the few places in the world where we actually have had innovation-led growth, there have been particular types of public agencies and a particular type of system of innovation, particular types of interactions between those organizations that we seem to not really have honed into. And that requires also a particular type of political economy. In my new book, Mission Economy, I look at the relationship, for example, between NASA and the private sector. NASA actually took care to rewrite the procurement contracts away from cost plus to fixed price contracts, or like a prize scheme with incentives for innovation, in order to get to the moon. So there was lots of public-private relationships and partnerships. It's never about the state versus private, but to get to the moon, they had to actually design that partnership to be governed in a particular way with, state direction, lots of bottom-up experimentation, but also things like a no excess profits clause. I mean, I found that incredible that NASA actually had a no excess profits clause in the Apollo contracts. And we all know that the wicked challenges today are much harder than the Apollo challenge. I know that, I write that in the book, the beginning, in the middle, and the end. But these really key issues of how to actually structure a purpose-oriented public actor that actually has a goal, and then structures itself to be flexible, nimble, but also it knows how to work with the private sector instead of outsourcing all the capacity to the McKinseys of the world, and structuring those contracts, procurement, loans, grants, and so on, to foster that bottom-up experimentation we need to reach the goal, for me is critical. And there's lots of lessons there, and I don't think we'll ever tackle the SDGs without that. And lastly, the reason I've set up the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is a full-blown department, it's not just an institute in an existing department, is my feeling is that we're not going to get the kind of change I assume all of us progressives that want without both new theory about issues around public purpose, public value, and the kind of political economy, putting purpose at the center, but also new practice. And the Institute is really based on this notion of practice-based theorizing. So we might all have great ideas, austerity sucks, invest how? What does it mean to actually have not only a counter-cyclical state, but one that actually, gets into the details of the nitty-gritty of purpose-oriented institutions. So when we actually then try to practice that, like with the Institute, we work a lot with policymakers setting up new institutions from scratch, like new public banks, in a purpose-oriented way. What do we learn in that process? Like, in actually working with policymakers, we need to be much more humble. It's not just about, here's my policy conclusions at the end of a working paper, and working with those policymakers, whether it was the European Commission that I worked with a long time around this notion of purpose and missions, whether it was helping countries rethink their industrial strategy, not just to be a handout to random sectors, but getting all the different sectors to be focused on challenges, whether it's setting up new financial institutions. We learn in that process and bringing the kind of dirty messiness of the learning by doing back to the theory. That's really why I set up the Institute. And I should say the thing I'm most proud of is what we're doing around the Masters in Public Administration. And I think we have lots of our MPA students listening in. For me, the goal was that, you can't have a better system without also having a new training of the mindset of the bureaucrats themselves. Like, bureaucracy should not be a bad word. How many of us use, oh, that's so bureaucratic, as a negative word? We need bureaucracies, but we have really problematic bureaucracies, and it's not a coincidence. Public choice theory and new public management, which are the ways that many civil servants continue to be trained, which are the kind of trickle-down effects of kind of mainstream economics for the public sector, doesn't really have an alternative. So what we're trying to do in the Institute is provide that alternative training, which hopefully will be shared globally in terms of the new textbooks based on 4 pillars in the curriculum. One around value, where does value come from? What does it truly mean to collectively create value instead of assume it's all in the private sector and the state is there to fix market failures or redistribute? So what is that alternative understanding of value? Second, purpose and mission. So purpose orientation, which, John Kenneth Galbraith also wrote quite a bit about. So what is a purpose-oriented design of political economy? Third is creative bureaucracies. And I'm very happy to co-direct the Institute with Rainer Cattell, who's a real expert on the Bavarian creative bureaucracy notion. And the fourth is kind of the design thinking and complexity theory that we need for modern day planning, which isn't just top down, but really kind of welcomes the uncertainty, the experimentation, but also that kind of design thinking lens on that. And those kind of new capabilities that we need within state institutions in order to drive public-private partnerships, in order to govern really crazy challenges, whether it's the health pandemic, climate change, or financial crisis, we need to invest in those capabilities. And the massive outsourcing that's been happening and continues to be happening. We've seen it, with COVID, where Deloitte had to do test and trace in the UK, but the kind of over McKinsey-fication, feel free to replace the I with the U, of governments is something that we should all be very interested in if we're interested in strong systems of innovation. And I'll stop there. I'll just end with saying that all our logos in the Institute are innovation is political, in the sense that, these are all very heavy political issues that I've just talked about. It's not just about kind of abstract theory and, policy conclusions at the end. Thank you.
I will comment on a part of your presentation of ideas, and I think it's important to say you rightly so began with the state. In fact, one needs a complete reversal of what we have learned in school to say, well, there is a self-contained system that is the market, and then you might have institutions that interfere or don't interfere with the market mechanism. This is crazy. The primitives of all societies are institutions, including some institutions that are based on pecuniary transactions that are called markets. There are different kinds of markets with different institutional architecture, different ways of interacting, interacting with each other. And there are boundaries, changing boundaries between institutions, non-pecuniary institution and pecuniary institution. If you go back to the book edited by Dick Nelson on the limit of market organization, you have, say, a picture of 30 years ago, what were the boundaries between these two types of institutions. Things have only got worse since, in the sense that pecuniary transactions have invaded fields that were not there, were not colonized before. I mean, education, health, especially in Europe, education and health were a public good, at least in principle. In the States, it's a bit different. Now you have got, even in the common language, you have got a supply of education, a demand for education. And of course, I mean, you're inclined to immediately draw a curve and then you put a price. And say, this is the equilibrium price, and then you have all the Pareto optimality theorem or not theorem, and then you say, well, if there is a distortion, this is all bullshit, ladies and gentlemen. One should start from institution as the primitives. And there are different kinds of institutions, to repeat. They go from the market to the state and many others. The family, your party, your church, your club, whatever. They're all, some are formal and some are informal institutions, but they govern behavior and they govern interaction and they shape the very identity of agents. Now, among these institutions in modern economies, the state is very important. And the state is fundamental in shaping the rate and direction of innovation. And with that, also the structure of industries. I mean, to say the state intervenes as the antitrust is ridiculous. The state intervenes shaping the very existence of industries and the direction in which they learn and they compete. And in fact, I mean, one interesting evolutionary question is what is the balance between what we call learning versus selection? That is the pattern and direction of capability augmentation and innovation, and the weeding out by market interaction that Marianna was talking about. Well, all the evidence that we have, I see that in the audience there is Federico Tamagni, with whom we worked with Bottassi and others. The market seems to be less important than learning in determining the overall dynamics of, say, productivity growth. This applies not only to countries that you say, well, the market does not work, Italy, France, but it applies also to countries that are the great example of market dominance, the United States and the United Kingdom. I would not even use the word imperfect competition. I mean, you have, because you have an evolutionary dynamics in which, of course, all firms, as Mariana was saying, are different. And there are some that are selected in favor, some are selected against. Some succeed and some fail, maybe they die. And this is the normal state of affair of capitalism. I mean, I think we should get rid of an apparatus in which one takes the general equilibrium benchmark and then compares the world to the general equilibrium benchmark and try to make the world as similar as possible to the benchmark, which also epistemologically is absolutely crazy. It is like saying, I've got a Ptolemaic idea of astronomy. If I observe that this is not the case in the real world, I try to make the sun moving and the earth stop. No, simply you've got a wrong theory. You don't have to make the astronomy adjust to your theory. It's simply crazy. Then, having said that, the practical, the operational task is, given the political economy of the relationship between social classes, interest groups, which ultimately determine where the state wants the pattern of innovation go or not go, where new paradigm emerge or new paradigm don't emerge, then we have got to politically decide where we want to go. And these are Mariana's mission. Mariana's mission that were also, you can find it in Chris Freeman. In the early discussion, I remember I was a kid, young and beautiful, at OECD in the early 80s, in which there were these two sort of basic view, the mission-oriented view of industrial policies and the so-called diffusion-oriented. Diffusion-oriented was basically leave the market alone. And the mission-oriented is the one that you start hearing again nowadays. With the election of Reagan and Thatcher, the American and the British delegates arrived at OECD, said very brutally, the diffusion-oriented has won, and the mission-oriented has lost. And if you think otherwise, we might even stop financing OECD. And so the OECD shut up on the mission for 30 years or so. Now missions are back. And Mariana is right in comparing, in having a sort of political economy organizational benchmark in the Apollo mission, with this relation between private public, with the fact that the mission is set by the public. This is important. This is exactly the opposite to let us finance industry, they know better where to go. Now, we want to go somewhere. We want to find a vaccine. We want to clean up the climatic shit. There we want to go. And then we want to make it feasible. And if we want the participation of of private industry also profitable, more modestly or not excessively profitable for private industry. But this is exactly the opposite of the current philosophy that says they know better. No, they don't know better. Because we have got public purposes, as Mariana puts it. Now, there are differences, though, between, say, the Apollo program and the climate change mission. The Apollo program, in many respects, was a win-win, in the sense that there was no social group that was losing on that. On climate, this is not the case. And it's not, I mean, the vulgata is the workers employed in dirty industry, then we've got to redeploy them. No, those that lose, I mean, the overwhelming majority of the shit that we put in the air come from 60 companies, 60. So, I mean, I appreciate very much the invitation by Greta to go by bicycle instead of taking the car. But let's keep in mind that if we want to establish radically new trajectories, we have got to stop these 60 people. 60 people, these 60 people are the oil companies, etc. And there they lose. They will lose. Putting in another way, we have got to put together the fight on climate change and a class dimension in which there are conflicting interests on income distribution, on power, and indeed on the amount of shit that you put in the environment. This is something that is dramatically lost in our discussion. I mean, we are all happy. It seems that in many of our discussion, we are all happy together. I mean, no, we're not all happy together. I shall come back then in the next intervention, but I think that Mariana wants to comment also on value production, value distribution, conflict, which is, I mean, a fundamental and neglected aspect of the current trends. For example, income distribution, but I leave it there. Mariana.
Sure. I was going to share just maybe one slide that represents kind of the conclusion of a lot of what I've been talking about recently, just because I think the big picture is important, no? Like, I think the problem with the innovation communities, we've gotten so siloed. You know, do we really need another study about patents and so on? Like, I think we know enough. And the fact our voice is not really out there. It's not really out there right now with these vaccines. There's 8 vaccines out there, of which actually the way they're currently produced not only is dysfunctional, but it's also very different. Like, the different actors in the system, those differences that we always talk about in evolutionary economics, right? You know, heterogeneity and so on. Actually, even with the vaccine production, you see heterogeneity.
Mariana, you're muted.
You're muted, Mariana.
Was I muted the whole time?
No.
Oh, you missed.
No, just the last
wonderful.
part.
Oh.
No, just for past 10
anyway,
seconds. Maria.
10 seconds. Okay, what did I say last? That's not good. That these different vaccines, if you look at the AstraZeneca, am I still muted? No. How the AstraZeneca vaccine is currently or was produced alongside publicly financed researchers at Oxford University, where this is a rare example also where the UK government acted, I think, in a pretty courageous and purpose-oriented way. They forced a negotiation, like a proper deal. You know, like we often talk about Green Deal. Well, what's a healthy deal? Where's the deal? You know, the green, we kind of know what needs to be done, but the deal requires a new social contract. And if you you know, in my book on value, I looked a lot at this ultra financialized form of capitalism where you have, you know, $4 trillion being spent by the Fortune 500 companies just on buying back their own shares to boost stock prices, stock options, executive pay. That kind of share buyback mania, which people like Bill Izonik and others have written about, including myself, represents a symptom of also what we have allowed in the system which actually value is being collectively co-created, and yet the deal between public and private often doesn't kind of represent that. So in the health sector in particular, and again, this is something I wrote about already in the entrepreneurial state, we have 40 billion a year, you know, of innovation funding coming from the US state, and yet the patents don't represent that. As you all know, patents are too wide, they're too strong, they're too upstream. Dick Nelson has written a lot about this with also Mazzoleni in that great article where you looked at, you know, how this is actually killing innovation. It's causing all sorts of rent extraction. But that's an outcome of a negotiation. I mean, the reason we had Bell Labs, you know, is because there was actually a deal between the US government and AT&T at the time where to retain that monopoly status, AT&T had to, as part of the deal, reinvest their profits into the system, invest in innovation and innovation beyond telecoms. So I'm very interested in how can we actually get better metrics in our community that we actually become interested in this in terms of the relational partnerships, because any biologist will tell you that the word ecosystem, which we all use too much, is not a normative word, right? You can have parasitic, you can have predator-prey ecosystems, or you can have mutualistic and symbiotic ones. So I think a really big also future question, this is something I've become very interested in because of all the talk about stakeholder value. What does a real stakeholder value relationship look like at the center of the system, not just as a corporate governance gimmick, you know, CSR or ESGs, but literally in how the different actors, and it's not just public and private, it's increasingly in areas like health and energy, you know, philanthropies and so on, and they too are often part of the problem. Anyway, so kind of, you know, the big first bucket for me is value. Where does it come from? How is it created? And this too is not a normative point. You know, the state, which we've been talking about, has also done all sorts of damage in that collective creation, not just in terms of war, but, you know, fracking and shale gas, which many say is a problem, I'm not an expert, came about mainly through state investment. Early on, just like it was mainly the state. Nanotech, internet, biotech, you know, internet, there's also lots of things maybe that we're not happy with. So it's not a normative point. It's not to say the state is great. It's actually, hey, if we actually had a theory about the collective creation of value in the economy, we would ask much more difficult questions that also held the state accountable. That's why I've become also very interested in working with organizations like the BBC, because they actually have metrics within their public organization around issues of public value. PBS, you know, public broadcasting in the US is a typical market failure fixing institutions, great documentaries, great high quality news, but they don't even dare to do things like soap operas and talk shows because they will get accused of kind of crowding out a business in that usual way that we all know that accusation is made, whether it's to public banks or otherwise. And yet they've resisted that. They have led in the creation of soap operas and talk shows through a metric of public value, which meant, you know, creating soap operas about the working class and not just, you know, Dallas and Dynasty about the 1%. For those that have any idea what I'm talking about, you're all probably too young. But they did that through this constant debate within about what is the role of a public actor in public broadcasting, pushing the frontier. And by doing it well, because they have invested in their own brain as opposed to outsourcing it, they've actually been leaders in the sector and crowded in, even though I don't like that word, we need better words. It's still crowding, right? Crowding in, crowding out. We need much more interesting words. In my book, The Entrepreneurial State, I called it dynamizing in. Anyway, all those issues matter. You know, so one of the things I've been doing with governments like finance ministries, which is, you know, where we know the purse strings are, is what is a better way to evaluate a public investment, not just in terms of which market failure was fixed, but also not just in terms of cost benefit analysis and net present value calculations. Had the moon landing been ex ante judged on cost benefit, they would have never bothered, but also ex post, all those dynamic spillovers that happen along the way, intersectoral, camera phones, home insulation, baby formula, software, the whole software industry, those are dynamic intersectoral spillovers along the way, even if they hadn't gotten to the moon and back in one generation, which was the goal. Because it was structured in that ambitious way, those spillovers, would have probably still occurred. So we need dynamic, not static evaluation. So just these words, are ones that I kind of try to delve and try to, alongside others. I'm not trying to be arrogant here, but it is a big project. It is about rethinking the economy and economics. We need to debunk all these words, but also in terms of the practice, how to do things differently. So if markets aren't just this thing that Giovanni said, but this is really about co-shaping, co-creating, not just fixing, what does that look like, literally in terms of these evaluation criteria I just talked about, as well as the design of the investments, not just a lender of last resort, but an investor of first resort. What does that look like? The organizational capacity. We all know that, through the wonderful work of, again, Nelson Winter and all those people, like also Luigi Marengo, who've contributed to learning theory. Well, what does organizational learning look like also within state structures? That trial and error and error and error and experimentation. Well, are you even allowed to do that in the civil service? As soon as you screw up, you're in the front page of the newspaper. So that explicit recognition that experimentation and sandboxing is needed, that needs to be literally in the HR contracts, the job descriptions, how you get promoted. And we know that's not the case. But the dynamic capabilities of the public sector, David Teese, dynamic capabilities in the business sector, but what does it look like also within the civil service? Finance, MMT obsesses about, money creation, and it's actually, a very interesting debate, and I'm, very good friends with Stephanie Kelton, but literally at the concrete level, what does an outcomes-based budgeting process look like? Where we always create money to go to war, why can't we normalize that admission that in order to tackle the biggest challenges we have and the kind of different missions underlying the SDGs, which require a cross-sectoral, cross-actor collaboration, what does a budgeting process look like if it really is truly outcomes focused? Pre-distribution, I think, is really crucial, because we might say we're interested in inequality, and we know, the labor share of global income is at the lowest it's ever been. The profit share is at the highest. Profits are not getting reinvested because of this whole financialized form of modern day capitalism. But what does it mean to increase that labor share, not ex post, but ex ante, in terms of the relationships? I always go back to the ecosystem, the relationships between the different actors, and that whole notion of sharing, not just in the risks with all this public money going in to health, innovation, climate, or digital divide, whatever, but also in how we structure the rewards, which doesn't just have to be monetary. It could also be through all sorts of dynamic conditionalities attached to public programs. That partnership issue, I've already talked about it. I really think our community needs to, given that we talk about ecosystems all the time, what kind of ecosystems? Literally, concretely, when producing a vaccine, what is a symbiotic and mutualistic ecosystem in the relationship between all those actors? And participation for me is crucial. A lot of the work that we've been doing in the Institute recently has been with cities. We just did an executive education program for mayors globally. I was just with Ada Colau, the mayor of Barcelona, on Friday this week. And something we can really learn from cities partly, or just even neighborhoods, and some of the actions that are happening there in terms of the climate battle, is how nested they are also in terms of citizen engagement. So the part of London where I live, Camden, I co-chair the Camden Renewal Commission, and the clean growth mission isn't just this kind of abstract thing of retrofitting buildings. It's also about getting people living in housing estates, so social housing, together to debate and discuss and contest the whole notion of what does it mean to live together also in a more sustainable way, precisely in order to make sure that who's at the table, that question of whose voice is at the table, is also open up. So we have diverse voices, but also that co-creation is true and not just kind of some sort of stakeholder engagement survey. It's really about the co-design of the project, the plan, what are we going to do? And I think there's lots to be learned from these more local city-based, but also neighborhood-based. In Sweden, we've worked a lot with the government there through Vinnova, the innovation agency, Sweden has this amazing macroeconomic mission of a fossil-free welfare state, but they land it on the very particular like school meals. So school meals in Sweden have to be healthy, tasty, not just IKEA meatballs, and sustainable. And that then determines the procurement, target for the meals, but also children and students in the schools get engaged by it because we all love our lunch. They learn about it through the curriculum. So citizen engagement to feel that actually this stuff matters to you because of the huge distrust we have today in both the state and business. I do feel like that's a huge can of worms that we should slowly also start theorizing and not just, admiring when it happens. I think we should
Well,
open up to our wonderful commentators.
Yeah,
No,
so Giovanni, do you want to quickly comment?
Yes, I want maybe to move back a bit more on the value distribution issue. I mean, what Mariana was hinting, I was just briefly mentioning it. I mean, we have over the last 40 years, at least one, stagnant wages, nearly stagnant wages, at least in the lower part of the distribution, and a divergence between productivity growth and wage growth. It occurs basically in all Western countries, but also in China. The elasticity of wages to productivity is well below one. So you've got a worsening of income distribution everywhere. This is a break at the end of the 70s, early 80s. And again, the speed is different across country, but it happens in every country. Of course, Mariana was already mentioning it, you've got declining labor share. And this is strictly associated with the loss of bargaining power of the workers and the presence of the union. This is particularly true in Anglo-Saxon countries, but the loss of power is true almost everywhere. You've got, of course, symmetrically, you've got a massive surge in corporate profit, and especially financial ones. Marianne has talked about it extensively. And not only those distributed, but also the buyback, etc. Now, finally, income distribution has come back to the scene because of the book of Piketty. That is a bit of a mess, but this is another matter. But the fact is there. So you have got soaring inequality, even within the same social group, even among wage earners, you have got an increasing divergence and polarization with the non-standard workers, the gig economy, etc., that end up being, in most cases, a sort of marginal proletariat that are told that they are not even proletariat, but they're entrepreneurs themselves and all this crap. This is what we analyze these things in greater detail in a paper by Marika Virgilit and myself on ILR, International Labour Review. And we are heading, if we keep going this way, toward what we call a sort of a Blade Runner society, a society in which you've got a techno-feudalism on one side, of a minority that holds political power, controls technology, and appropriates most of the value, and the rest. That is the opposite to the New Deal social democratic capitalism after World War II. I think the discussion on climate change, on innovation, should be placed into this scenario. And when we say a Green New Deal, we want a new green, but also a New Deal in the sense of a social pact among social classes, and I repeat the word social classes because social classes still exist, that is inclusive and universal, and that rediscovers the public values and the universal rights that Mariano was talking about. Otherwise, I mean, I'm tired of telling and hearing a story in which either how to grow. Finally, there is a system of innovation that is able to grow garlic in Greenland. And there's the story of the growth of garlic in Greenland, or some estimate of the patent and the variation on the nature of the patent and the instrument and the effect on whatever, on 1.01% of productivity growth. I think we should go back to deal with these big issues.
Mhm. Giovanni, yeah, I mean, what I tried to do in The Value of Everything, the book before Mission Economy, was precisely that a lot of also these issues cannot be tackled just ex post through better taxation or regulation and so on. It has to be nested within a different theory of value itself. And interestingly, you know, the classical economists who actually were able to distinguish rents from profits, which modern day GDP doesn't do, had a theory of value which, you know, was in no way perfect, but at least it was nested within production and the division of labor and actually looking at how different actors work together. Think of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, all based on the concept of the division of labor and understanding it within a particular sector. Imagine if we did that today with the pharmaceutical sector. And of course, many around this huge room of how many do we have now? Wonderful 287 people have contributed to that. But unfortunately, the ways that often these issues around inequality are tackled are ex post. So what does it mean to actually increase labor's share of global income by precisely actually focusing on that collective creation of value process, as opposed to accepting the narratives, the framings, the theory that currently gets taught all over the world, and just then picking up the mess. And that's, by the way, why I preferred to go to the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research than in some of its kind of, you know, associated institutions like UMass Amherst, because at the New School from day one, a lot of the focus was on value. And the fact there's different value theories, there's not just one, but it would already be very useful, I think, for our community, the evolutionary economics and innovation, you know, whatever the hell community, to go back to some of these fundamental questions. You talked about institutions as kind of first principles, well, value, and how we understand it, how we talk about it. Because my experience is that the confidence in the room, and there's a lot of issues around confidence when you look at how states, whether it's competition authorities or New York and, you know, in the deal with Amazon, which, you know, fell through, there's no real confidence in the room to strike that deal, which I focus a lot on the word deal. But to build that confidence, it's not just about going to a therapist. It has to actually be underpinned by a strong and much broader concept of collective value creation and stakeholder value, how the system itself works. But I got a note saying that we're supposed to now ask our wonderful friends.
Yes, we should. We should move to the panel. Before that, would you like to take a quick break for 5 minutes? This was our initial plan. So we can take a quick break, five minutes, and then we start with the panel. Yeah.
If you want, I think we're going to lose people if we do that. I normally leave and don't come back.
Okay, so then we cut short the break.
I'm kidding. It's up to
and
others.
Then we can cut short the break. That's fine. We can move to the panel if you want. Yeah.
Or people can bring their computers to their coffee machine, not to the toilet though. Don't make that mistake.
Okay, let's take a quick break and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Thanks for coming back.
We lost 37 people.
Yeah.
No one
Thank-
took their camera to the toilets, I hope.
No one.
So, yeah, so I guess Maria is around. Is Giovanni back?
He might be in the toilet.
Okay, so we can start back. So we now move on to the questions from the panel and then to the floor. So I would start with Maria Savona, you're here.
Yes, thank you. I think Giovanni is back. I don't know. Well, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, this is, as usual, the usual stellar discussion about where this community should be going. And I think it's important that we do this reflection. Can you hear me okay? My connection is, yeah?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we can hear you.
I guess, Mariana, my question is, let's say two small questions, I think interrelated. So first of all, my main interest in the link between theory and policy, put it very simply. So my first question is, where do you believe your theoretical belonging is? So for example, is what in your approach is eminently, for example, Marxian, or eminently evolutionary, or eminently classical? And it would be great to know that, because the reason I'm asking is that in our common discussion or battle with the neoclassical approach, one of the things that I have heard used in this rhetoric is that non-neoclassical approaches are ideological, right? And this is the usual stuff they come to. And I guess part of this sort of accusation or use of this narrative is that there is a lack of theoretical consistency, because they think that not being ideological means deriving policy implication from theoretically consistent framework. So I guess as a community, I was wondering what you think about it. Our joint effort should be to, to talk about something that is theoretically grounded. And I'm thinking about what we actually say about them, that the usual policy implication they derive from their theoretically consistent framework is this one size fits all, right? That we want to avoid. And I was wondering whether, for example, in your tremendous impact in the policy realm, whether there is not a risk of having, for example, mission-oriented policies considered as a sort of one-size-fits-all, possibly because in the end, missions are epoch-specific rather than country-specific or sector-specific, or something that you can recognize the heterogeneity of. So that's more or less, I would like to know your views about this two issues. So theoretically belonging and what to avoid, how to avoid the one-size-fits-all narrative or rhetoric that gives so much ground to the counterpart, as we said. Thank you.
Yeah. Should I answer each one on its own? Yeah. Is that how this works? Sorry, I should have asked before.
Yeah.
I'll come in. Okay. So Maria, I mean, if I completely agree with you, but my interest in actually theorizing about the state and going back to classical political economy, this is way before, missions for me, by the way, is just an example. I think, the risk is whether we obsess about examples. It's just a way to help design policies with purpose at the center. Those policies, as I mentioned in the beginning, need to be nested very much also into local understanding. So how you put purpose at the center of procurement design is not, cut and pastable across different geographical areas, let alone different sectoral areas. So I'll come back to that in a second, because that's your second point. But the bigger point, theory. I mean, if anything, I feel like there's very few of us who have contributed on the theoretical front. And I started talking about how competition theory is something that, of course, Schumpeter contributed a lot to, and I actually think our own community stopped contributing to that. If you think, I mean, obviously the greats that are, also around this table have done a huge amount, but more the younger scholars that have followed, who've kind of gotten lost in the weeds, the contribution to an alternative theory of competition of the kind, I don't know if you remember the articles by people like also IWAI, on those great articles he wrote in Jibo, of actually modeling a different way to understand how firms were competed, or Dosi, Silverberg, and Orsenigo, which was fundamentally a paper about competition. We have actually stopped, unfortunately, also training our PhD students to develop that alternative theory of competition, which then, I think there's some confusion in the chat. My point was, of course, the problem with neoclassical theory is the Schumpeterian problem, that to talk about innovation, they need to talk about imperfect competition. But have we as a community really helped advance an alternative theory of competition, which then has informed competition authorities, antitrust agencies today around, say, the big tech issue? We just had a meeting yesterday, by the way, with the FTC crowd, the Lina Khan team, the European Commission, Vestager's team, and in the UK, the CMA, on this issue. But I see my work very much nested within that attempt. I'm not saying I'm perfect in any way, but for me, it was always the theoretical issues that drove my work, especially having been grounded in classical political economy, which for me is very important precisely in that kind of objective versus subjective lens. And by objective, it's not about deterministic, but objective, literally looking at production. Who's doing what? Who's getting what and why? The classicals had a theory of production that also was related to a theory of income distribution that actually requires, again, an ability to ask these questions: who earns what and why, in that objective way, grounded in a theory of production. We can also look at the work of staff and so on. So definitely, I would say, my inspired, mentors in terms of the old literature, classical political economy, Keynes, who I think is one of the most under theorized people, because all these Keynesian economists who then at best understood Keynes talking about the counter-cyclical role of government, but not actually also what is the role of government during the boom, precisely so it doesn't set up the conditions for the next crisis. People like Carlota Perez have contributed massively to that, but also the nitty-gritty of the how. In the recession, yes, we need counter-cyclical investment. Yes, we forgot to do that after the financial crisis, but the how to do that. So it's not just helicopter money, which just, digging ditches and filling them up again. That how question is what drove me. So the kind of framing and the contours of the big Keynesian question, but the how. But obviously that's a massive theoretical point, to begin with the need for counter-cyclical government, but to also understand that actually this is also beyond the business cycle, because during the boom, a lot of the investments I look at in the entrepreneurial state actually happened in the boom. And the big theoretical advancement that I've tried to contribute to, amongst others, is in fact an alternative to the market failure fixing theory. And what I've tried to do in the book also is to kind of outline what that theory might look like across these four big pillars. I call it ROAR, the first one on directionality, roots and directionality, the R, the O on organizational capacity and a theory of organizational capacity, the A, the kind of assessment and evaluation that we actually require both theoretically and in practice, and the R, the sharing of risks and rewards. So we have a theory of predistribution, both in terms of the sources of inequality, but also what to do with it. For me, these are huge theoretical questions, and I'd love it if more people, especially in SPRU, by the way, would start really going down that path, because I do think SPRU lost its way. I'm going to say this really openly. I know many might disagree or agree, but since Pavitt, Freeman, Dosi, and so on, I do think we got a bit too lost in the weeds of, doing some very detailed empirical work, which, as important as it is, and I've, done a lot of empirical work myself, stopped asking the big questions that people like Carlota continue to ask. On the missions, all my work, I don't know if you've read it, Maria, is not about cut and paste at all. It's precisely about that heterogeneity, policy doesn't have a one-size-fits-all. That's why we need practice-based theorizing. That's why we actually need institutions like I've tried to set up, where we actually hire people based to do that, to actually go spend time. We might do great theory. We've hired people to also then go spend time with actors to learn just how difficult it is. So because it's not a one-stop shop, you need to learn, setting up a public bank in Scotland, we just learned just how difficult it was even to have a framing and a theory that could guide the civil servants then hired into the bank to think about portfolio analysis, risks and rewards, those kind of finance 101 questions. What do they mean from a public service perspective? And that required 2 years to do, and a humbleness, a level of kind of listening and not just going in and preaching, which, to be honest, I find many academics within our community and others often don't have time for, because we're all judged just by our citation indices. And unfortunately, many people, that's all they care about. That's going to be their big contribution to have made their H factor go up. Ideally, we would do both, write great works that are cited, but also works that matter and that reflect local realities and us as listeners, not just preachers, and bringing back to the theory that nitty-gritty and concreteness that we're learning along the way.
Thanks, Mariana. Let's move on to Luke. Luke is here, so we'll have enough time for question and answer later from the floor. Luke, are you here? Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Lindy. Let me put it to you, Mariana, let me emphasize at the start really how your whole approach fits very well Chris Freeman. And I think in particular the last points you made, and where you insist continuously on this practice relevance and this practice-based theorizing, where indeed we as researchers get confronted with reality in terms of implementing policymakers, but also implementing the various areas. I think this is an area where you fit perfectly within the Freeman tradition, and which I cannot say from some of my colleagues, which have rarely been confronted with practice in the sense as you describe it. And I think this is what I like very much with the approach to public purpose and mission, and the way also you emphasized in your presentation also the importance or the recognition to be humble vis-a-vis the policymakers, vis-a-vis the bureaucracy. And it brings me, of course, to the whole issue about direction, mission, orientation, purpose in our research area, and where, of course, the policymakers, the civil servants, who then are confronted with some of those missions, and I'm thinking here very much, of course, about the 5 European missions, which were, I mean, if I may say so, were coming out of your presentations, your convincing powers with the policymakers, how then at the implementation level, these poor civil servants, whether they are European Commission civil servants or national civil servants or regional civil servants, are confronted with all this experimentation, re-experimentation, tryouts, etc. And then in the end, they get the accountants coming to see them and saying, you know, how can you justify, for God's sake, you invested so much money. We gave 200 billions to Italy in the next generation recovery mode. And you already see from some other countries coming questions about how has this money been spent? The audit, just so not just the finance as you highlighted, where you look at the outcomes in your budget, but the accounting side afterwards, where you look at what has been realized, and where we are still in a mode of looking very much about civil servants having to justify the expenses they allocated and how it was carried out. And this is where I saw also a question here from one of the participants raising the issue about whether these ESG criteria, this where the accounting firms are starting to move in a direction, not just of finance indicators, but the others, economic, social governance indicators, where this could be a way forward in this area for civil servants. That's my question, Marianne.
Thank you, Luke. And you and I were together in many of those rooms, weren't we, with the missions? It's all, you know, the devil's in the detail. I'm just going to share one thing because it's just in a deck that I sometimes prepare, which is precisely on the issue you just raised, which is, you know, you'll remember that the second report I wrote for Europe was on implementation. What the hell do we do with this concept? Because remember that missions, as we all agree, but sometimes we forget, are about starting with the challenge. And we've got the SDGs, we've all signed up to them. Those are the challenges, they're not the missions. Beneath them must be missions and moonshots that do what? That get as many different sectors involved. These are not siloed projects. You know, the cancer mission is not just about health sector going after cancer, it's also about the preventative issues, which of course require new forms of nutrition and so on. So that intersectoral, but the big issue, the big nitty gritty difficult thing that you're talking about is the beneath that how do you then galvanize amongst the projects across these different sectors to be more than the sum of the parts that actually then help fuel solutions to those big kind of moonshots. So, you know, start with clean oceans, SDG 14, getting 90% of the plastic out is, you know, could be the mission in a specific amount of time, all the different sectors that would have to be working towards that. But, how, you know, what does it then mean for an industrial strategy, an innovation policy, a procurement policy, a mission-oriented public financial institution helping to crowd in those who are willing. So instead of picking winners, picking the willing, that's a crucial change, right? But some of these issues around proactive portfolio management, you know, what does that actually look like? And so on the evaluation, you know, I've started to refuse to talk to any innovation minister if the finance minister is not also in the room, because that's where the purse strings are. So you can get all the cool things you want in the kind of ministry in charge of the funky stuff, health, education, innovation. But as long as we don't affect how the finance ministry thinks, we're screwed, because those projects, even when they happen, and the problem is in many parts of the world, you don't get active public investment, but even when you get that investment, if it's then evaluated with the usual, you know, market fixing criteria that they have, then it's not going to be funded the next time around. Let me stop sharing this. This is just from a table that we wrote for an article around some of these issues, which I can share later. And so in the UK, it's called the Green Book. Every country has their own book, the Red Book, the Green Book, the Blue Book, which guides the Treasury on that evaluation. So, you know, what I'm very interested in is I'm worried that these missions in Europe, which I didn't set up the mission boards or any of that. What I tried to do was to help Europe stop just randomly selecting sectors, technologies. Every time they thought of a technology, by the time they got to it, that technology had already moved on. The sectors that continue to get a lot of funding are often, you know, there because of lobbying or industrial strategies in the UK. We had, before this missions concept, just like in Holland, they have their top sectors. In the UK, we had our key sectors, which were aerospace, automotive, finance, life sciences, and the creative sector. You know, what do you want them to do? What are these sectors? There's many not on that list, right? So instead of choosing random sectors, being really bold on the challenges, and then backtracking in the redesign of innovation policy, industrial strategy, procurement, to focus on these challenges that would then require these different sectors, not just your random list of ones that lobbied their way into being the priority sectors, to really work together in new ways, to create that additionality, making things happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. But that design of something like procurement that I mentioned with the Apollo program, where they changed it from cost plus to fixed price with incentives for innovation and quality improvement, it's, you know, that's the stuff that then counts. And if you don't do that, the risk is these missions just become a new word on top of something else that before was called smart something or cluster policy or whatever the hell. And it just makes us feel good because it sounds good, but it's just an excuse to keep doing what we were doing before. So what I'm very interested in is, what does it actually mean for doing things differently? And coming back to one of the things we talked about before the deal, I'm incredibly interested in what it means for the new types of contracts between public and private. And, you know, I talked already about the vaccine, but you definitely have this with digital platforms, where most of the technology was actually funded by the state, and yet the kind of relationship with big tech that are actually media companies. They didn't fund the tech. They're really media companies that should be regulated as such. But whether it's in that space, energy, you know, with these, you know, all these different types of renewable energy companies there as well, the deal is just as important. So what does a mission-oriented approach mean for that kind of partnership? What does it mean for the procurement? These are the nitty-gritty questions, and I fear that Europe is not giving enough attention to that. So we've set up these mission boards around these 5 mission areas, but they haven't actually done their homework, kind of workshopping it, testing it, sandboxing it, learning how to do it maybe in a limited area, like the example of procurement, and then scaling it up. So we have these big words, and also, unless it's done at the cabinet level, it continues to be something mainly for the Horizon program. The lost opportunity is not to put it at the center of the Green Deal policy, and that's at the cabinet level. That's von der Leyen, right? So I think we need to take missions out of the little ghetto that they're currently in, which is innovation policy. And that's, again, why I refuse to just talk to science innovation ministers. You have to have the finance person in the room. But these are the nitty-gritty questions that I'm interested in, that I think if Europe doesn't actually, see them through, now that we have the missions instrument, the risk is it's just kind of another opportunity for another word that academics introduce, but just cover up something that was already being done before. And I think the concept of additionality, making things happen that otherwise would have not have happened, especially around business investment, which continues to be lower than average in many European countries. So how do you catalyze, galvanize, crowd in, dynamize in business investment so the state doesn't have to do everything, but with a strong direction, public purpose? That's really the key thing. And we all know that R&D tax credits often don't work precisely because they end up just having an effect on profits. And the patent box policy, which is one of the foolish policies ever, has just increased profits in many of these sectors that use it. And so what does it mean to have that portfolio of different policies where the tax incentive ends up being icing on the cake for the marginal contribution on R&D, but the actual willingness, desire, the kind of animal spirits of even wanting to invest in a bold new area is kind of guided through these kind of mission-oriented investments. And I don't think Europe, my evaluation is they haven't gotten their hands dirty on a lot of these questions. And they should,
We could.
Little comment. My impression is that Europe has taken the word mission, but has not taken up missions. Mission are an objective. The word says having an objective, going to the moon. How do you evaluate the success?
No, but Giovanni, it's more than an objective. Objectives can be building a wall between Mexico and the US. The objective can be a nanotech sector from scratch. That's not that's the design of these missions to be intersectoral and to foster that bottom-up solutions across sectors and not just be a project.
It depends on which kind of mission. And this is politics, as you are saying. What we have, but if you have a mission, then the criteria of evaluation is the success, like in a war. Did you succeed in winning the war or not? If this is the mission, then you mobilize resources, you do X, Y, Z. Of course, in a war, you don't have economists to have cost-benefit analysis. You say, I want to win the war, to paraphrase our prime minister, whatever it takes. And if you win it, you are successful. If you lose it, you are not successful. Full stop.
But Giovanni, the design of missions, have you read? Because the whole design of missions is precisely what you're saying, and that's how they have accepted it. So are you saying they're not doing what they agreed to do?
Yes, I'm saying that. I'm saying that. I'm saying
that
I think we need to see. I agree with you, Giovanni, because I think it's too early because they actually took such a long time to actually now settle on these 5 missions. They have these mission boards and so on. And I think it's important for us not just to be dismissive, let's see, but the problem is unless we invest within Europe, also in the capacity at the member state level, Giovanni and I are Italian. The whole riforma della pubblica amministrazione was cutting the public service. The usual bullshit that it's too much red tape when actually, it might be slow, but there's not more laws and regulations in Italy. They're just very bad at actually, implementation in many different areas and too slow in those areas. But why? Do we actually have in Italy over the last half century an investment within the civil service? to be agile, flexible. Again, the reason I look at the Apollo program is precisely because NASA, on the back of the Apollo 1 fire, realized that their own organizational structure would have never gotten them to the moon. The whole kind of George Mueller coming in, setting up those project managers, each with their own delegated team, but in constant communication one with another. You know, that's the whole point about having an all-of-government approach, where you don't just have each department doing its own thing without an interdepartmental kind of strategy. And of course, the Apollo, mission is completely different. That's, we all know that, but that attention to organizational design and investment within our public organizations, that's what hasn't happened. And the head of procurement in NASA, his name was Ernest Brackett, he said, if we continue to outsource our own capability to the private sector, because they were already starting to do that, we will get captured by brochuremanship. Because at the time they didn't have PowerPoints, they had brochures that the companies would come in to work with NASA. And that's what has happened in most countries. Governments have gotten captured by brochuremanship. They don't even know how to write the terms of reference. It's not even about privatization. It's the government no longer having that public sector capacity. So my fear is if Europe doesn't realize that that's a key issue across the member states, you can have the best, missions and even mission boards and mission policies you want, but it then falls on really empty and weak actors. And in Italy, we've had to give back the European money for decades now because we don't even know how to spend it, let alone this new era now with the next gen EU. We'll see what happens. But this is why we give a lot of attention to the training and to the redesign, that institution building that Giovanni, you mentioned was just so crucial. Our community needs to be part of that. Otherwise, it's really easy to critique Europe and say it's all rubbish. Carlotta, it's your turn.
Yes.
Okay, great. There are so many interesting questions that I hate to take the time, but I do want to ask a personal question. Mariana, one of the things that has always astonished me about you is that you are the most non-workaholic I have ever known. You never work on weekends. You dedicate them completely to your family, 100%, and to do healthy and cultural activities with your children. You go to parks, to a swimming pool, cooking, theaters, museums, or whatever. All that, you write books and articles and supervise PhD students and teach and give talks and advise higher and higher politicians, and you receive hundreds of requests to give talks. What has made a workaholic trap? How do you do it?
Well, you're the one who's always telling me not to work on weekends. So she has an agenda here. She wants me to work less. No, I'm just kidding. So maybe, and I'm not saying this about myself, I just maybe say it about people I admire. And Walter Benjamin actually had a really good essay about this.
Mariana, you're muted.
Mariana, you're muted.
Just the last few seconds. We lost it. Yeah.
Really? Do I keep touching it? I was saying that what I also admire in others, so maybe it's also who do I look up to? And it comes back to the first point I made about Chris Freeman, Carlotta Perez, and Eric Hobsbawm. But even, I think, Karl Marx, if you read Capital, it's full of details, so that kind of love of life and giving attention, remember that chapter on the factory acts in Capital? Jesus Christ, the attention that man made to details. And the real problem, I think, and I'm going to get to the question properly, but I think it's important to go back to that first bit about Chris. We need people who do what Maria was also saying, which I thought was a really good question, that can also theorize and understand and be critical, have a critical lens, both in understanding our system, let's just call it the capitalist system, but also thinking critically how to change it. But I think it's impossible unless you actually take the time to build friendships, to talk to the trade unionists, to work with policymakers in that humble way. And I'm not religious at all, maybe I should be one day. I have actually started talking to the Pope about some of these issues, which is fascinating because he does talk about the common good, which I think it goes beyond the public good. But anyway, sorry, distraction. I do think there's something about this stuff is easier when you actually like spend time with people and actually, you know, I'm thinking of the Camden Council work, spending time with Georgia Gould, who's the Labour Party leader of Camden Council, and walking through the neighborhoods of Camden, walking through the estates, talking to the resident associations, or going inside the youth centers that today, I mean, this is the thing that really breaks my heart, but knife crime in London, like these young boys from lower social economic backgrounds literally killing each other, stabbed to death every weekend, talking to mothers, you know, being inside the youth centers. It's not me like Mother Teresa, but if you care about changing the system, you better talk to people, and you better also like people and kind of love life along the way. And I think it's that love of life that I really sense from Chris Freeman's work, from, again, Eric's work, who I always go back to because I think he really was one of the best historians ever, but also Carlotta, your life. You know, Carlotta is one of my best friends, let me just say it, someone who I really rely on, and just the life she led, you led, Carlotta, fighting the good fight, even going to, you know, prison along the way for a short period, you know, so on and so forth. That's important. And I think, unfortunately, how academia has been structured is that because all people give a shit about is their H factor and their citations and who's citing who and which journals and little tiny articles without asking the big questions, that actually breeds a certain type of human being that actually stops interacting with the society around them. So I just want to say that, because that, to me, I think it's important. And I have definitely been guided by people like yourself. In terms of kids, I mean, it was not on purpose. I somehow ended up with all these children. But for me, they've been very important to make myself not take myself too seriously, I think. And you know, it doesn't have to be through kids. It can be through friendships. I know many people without kids that also, you know, have this because also of political activity or taking friendships seriously, just remembering that you're, you know, just being challenged, being able to laugh. And I think if we stop laughing, you know, weekends are for laughing. Weekends should be about kind of that reset that reminds us about the bigger picture. And having a friend like you, Carlotta, that has constantly said, you're doing too much, you're doing too much, you're doing too much. Especially after my mother died. And she used to say that too. She used to say, you're not breathing, are you? Can you please take a breath in this conversation? Carlotta really has become that whisper in my ear of, take a deep breath. So I'll just say, having friends like you, Carlotta, has made life, you know, much sweeter, much sweeter.
That was a great conversation. So let's try to pass the floor to the audience. We do received a lot of questions. I see like 7 pages of questions. So we'll do something similar to what we did in the previous conversation series. So we won't be likely able to take all of them, but we will send all these questions to Mariana, whom we know that she has a busy schedule, but in the coming days or weeks in between her weekend cake making, if you get time, you could reply to them. But many of the questions you also already replied. So I would just pass on to in the questions in order that we received. First of all is from Andrew Reed from Canada. He's here. Would you like to ask your question, Andrew? Yeah.
Yes, I'm unmuted. So I just say at the beginning that my background is in industry, so quite different from most of the participants here. Joseph Schumpeter, as I understand, pointed out that development occurs when innovation directed by the risks and rewards of competitive markets increases economic efficiency and improves living standard. Efforts to accelerate adoption of particular innovations or alter the trajectory of technical change manipulate those risks and rewards which would otherwise constrain a market-directed innovation process. Instead of development, you get unsustainable growth because efficiency suffers, and a painful adjustment, namely a Schumpeterian crisis, often follows. So therefore, aren't public purpose-oriented or mission-oriented innovation schemes therefore just encouraging crony capitalism? Those who capture the rents created by such schemes prosper at the expense of the many whose living standards suffer in the process.
Thanks for the question. Sorry, oops. There we go. I had to move room because I no longer had a battery, so I had to run to where there was a charger. So it's a really good question, and the whole question of capture is huge. Now, I might be wrong, because what I am often told, or the counter to some of my work already with the entrepreneurial state, which really wasn't about missions, it was more about this investor first resort and collective creation of value, and the kind of history to be told of what actually got us, blockbuster drugs or the internet and so on, and what that then means for economic theory to kind of pay more attention to a theory of the state as a investor, a risk taker, and so on, and not just a redistributor or market fixer. For me, those questions that then arise from that, those big ROAR questions, ROAR, that I talked about before, including the metrics like the BBC one of public value, which holds the state accountable to what it's actually doing, or purpose, which is the bigger concept. Missions are just an example of purpose. Those bigger questions of what is the state even doing? We don't even look at the state investments in fracking. Most people don't even realize that it was fracking, that the state was the early investor first resort in fracking. And so we ended up just on the back of that, debating whether it's good or bad, and all the people who are criticizing fracking and telling the state what it should do now around that regulation. But where were those voices ex ante asking the state why it was even doing that investment in the first place? And we don't ask those questions, as well as we don't ask the risk reward question that you mentioned. So we end up just socializing risks and privatizing rewards, because we don't open up this black box of what is the state. And so for me, missions were actually a way to hold the state accountable, because what I was seeing, and I continue to see it, especially now that industrial strategy is back, look at the whole Biden infrastructure bill. My view, and I'll just say it because we don't have that much time, is that without the thinking about an entrepreneurial state and purpose-oriented policies, the risk of capture is even higher. We always have the risk of capture, but it's even higher if the state is seen as a facilitator, as an enabler, as a market fixer. Because you know what? There's going to be lots of lobbying that comes along the way and asks, oh, I want to be enabled, or here's a business-friendly, in quotes, policy focused on commercialization. When you don't have a purpose, it becomes much easier, I think, for the lobbying effort and the capture effort to rise up the ladder, because the state has no clue what it's for. Now, I'm not saying that just because we introduce missions or purpose or any of these words, then it becomes easy. Precisely coming back to Luke's question, which is, how do you actually do this stuff? That's why I personally am very interested in working with an organization as specific as the BBC and asking what is the equivalent of that public value metric they have for, say, the NIH. The National Institutes of Health, why don't they? They have, I think, been captured actually by the pharmaceutical industry. So all the money that goes in, great. We can say the state invested in it, but why the hell did they not manage to create conditionality on how the intellectual property rights are governed? Of course, it's their job. When I speak to them in private, they say, yeah, you're right. But you know what? Basically, in between the lines, they're saying, if we start going down that path, we're not going to get our budget in the Budget Appropriations Committee, because it's going to look a bit socialistic. So my view is that the kind of stuff I'm pushing for, and it's difficult, and I think we need more people, and there's obviously, I'm riding on the shoulders of the giants like Dick Nelson and Maori and so on, but these questions that I've tried to further develop are ones that hold the state more accountable, given its important role. The fact it's had an important role is not my point. I mean, it's not what I'm saying should happen, it's what has happened. The fact we don't ask these questions mean that that very important potential role in the right direction, in terms of the directionality, doesn't happen, because we continue just to talk about facilitation, market fixing, enabling, de-risking. De-risking is a completely problematic word. It makes it much easier to socialize risks and privatize reward, because we don't admit actually that it required a lot of experimentation. Why should it be that the US government bails out Solyndra and doesn't get any sort of share, even temporary, in Tesla? Same amount of money went to both. It was a portfolio, post-crisis, financial crisis. On the back of that, everyone used Solyndra as the modern day Concord example. Government's rubbish, doesn't know what it's doing, without any open discussion about the portfolio that underlaid Obama's failed attempt, but attempt to direct a stimulus program in a green direction. What should have been the bigger questions rather than the crowding out, accusation.
Thanks, Mariana. Is Bentoke there? We have a question from Bentoke. A lot of pages of people I don't see. Bentoke, are you here?
Yeah. Mariana, I one of your admirers regarding especially the success you have had in moving away from this kind of failure of fixing and pointing to the state as opening up new opportunities. So that I think is quite important. I have spent a lot of my time giving advice on building stronger national innovation systems in Nordic countries, later together with Luc at the European level, and also at the OECD, etc., etc. Since 2000, I have worked mainly on more global issues. And I must confess, gradually, I feel a little uncertain about what I've done so far. I mean, if it's correct, which I think it looks like, that intellectual rents are really what feeds the new rich economies, and where the willingness to share intellectual property, formally legalized or just secret knowledge with the poor countries. I think we need, in a sense, to have this kind of global perspective, so that it's not only a question about inequality in terms of labor share, as Giovanni was speaking. There are, as I see it, some very systematic kind of, more specifically, digital colonialism in this era. And I would like to hear what you say about this. I mean, how can we, and actually I would say also that Chris, he was not only a person focused on giving good advice to governments in the rich countries. He was also a very critical observer of the world system, asking for major changes. How can we combine these two very difficult things, being advisors to institutions which are actually part of the problem?
I agree with you 100%. And coming back to the humbleness point, we can definitely not cut and paste solutions from the north to the south. But your question is much deeper than that. And I'm currently chairing the World Health Organization Council on the Economics of Health for All. So Dr. Tedros actually asked if I was interested in being the chief economist. I said, absolutely not, for the reasons that Carlotta mentioned in terms of workload. But I was very interested in helping the WHO, which, as you know, has a huge focus on the global south, to actually think about some strong, like a new economics framework, basically, right? So instead of just doing the kind of Jeff Sachs approach, and with admiration for everyone's efforts, so it's not dismissive, but some of the important work that Jeff Sachs has done has been more about invest in health and it's good for the economy. We said invest in health for all, right? So the vaccine is not the mission. Vaccinating the whole entire world, vaccinating Africa is the mission. Work backwards. What does it mean for the economy? So health for all is the goal, and you can, again, break it down into different areas, including the vaccine. What does it mean for the design of our economic structures, whether it's the budgeting process I talked about, but especially the issues around these public-private partnerships, the procurement, the intellectual property rights, so on and so forth. So on that, for example, the fact that, first of all, this council is only women. And when they ask us why, we say, why the bleep, bleep, not, given how many councils have been only men, but with a very strong Global South representation, whether it's the head of Fiocruz in Brazil, Vera Songwe, who runs the UN Commission for Africa, and so on. But the point also of this council, coming back to the implementation and practice-based theorizing, is not just to come up with big ideas, and the ideas are around value, capacity, innovation, and financing, all around health for all, but then to implement it locally. So it's that implementation phase that isn't just, oh, here's a great idea. Stephanie Kelton is in the Council on money creation. Of course not. It's about working locally to expand the fiscal space in some countries, especially in Africa, that not only have reduced their fiscal space, but due to the conditionalities of the IMF and the World Bank, created very problematic structures, especially in terms of how public and private interact. And so, the reason we've ended up needing so much philanthropy and charity in many parts of the world that are still developing is not because, it has to be that way. It's because of that lack of industrial capacity, that lack of implementation capacity on the ground. And why is that, right? So reversing that process is key. And the problem is, I'm also advising, along with Danny Roderick, I'm on the advisory council of President Ramaphosa in South Africa. There, my interest has been not so much even of the public-private, but the public-public. Like when you have a state-owned enterprise, as many developing countries have, like Eskom in the energy sector, that's obviously part of the problem, also due to the questions that arose before around corruption and nepotism and capture. So what should the relationship be with the Ministry of Finance, the Treasury, and its state-owned enterprise? And that state-owned enterprise, again, how should it be governed? What is its role in a green transition and so forth? These questions around SOEs are huge. In Italy, we had the IRI, Istituzione della Ricostruzione Italiana, which had 3 phases: public and not politicized. The top managers wanted to work in it. This was the era where they made the Autostrada del Sole in 4 years from north to south, the achievement. Public, super politicized with all the parties, putting their hands in, and then privatized. The second and third phase were equally tragic. The third phase, the worst. They cut all the research and development. Same thing happened to Telecom Italia when it was privatized. But even the second phase of public and politicized was tragic. So what does it mean to create public institutions that are not politicized, that are purpose-oriented, that aren't just short-term around the electoral cycle, so on and so forth? These questions are even more important in developing countries, but they're also not all the same. I always hated the concept of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. My God, they're so different from each other. And so really nesting our understanding on the local institutions and structures and those relational issues, which in South Africa is different today from Rwanda. We put Africa all in a box. That's very condescending. So that heterogeneity that we talk a lot about in evolutionary economics, it equally applies across countries, understanding the history of why certain institutions are also behaving in a certain way in a particular country, but also being able to rise above the horizon and focus on the concept of a state-owned enterprise without getting too bogged down in the details. These are really critical questions that I wish more of our wonderful researchers, hopefully still online, even though I keep seeing we're losing them by the second.
Yeah, so we are talking about local institutions. We also have a question from Aneta Sukbida. The question was if you know any good examples when of local mission-oriented policies, regardless of constraints from the national at the national level. I don't know if she's around.
Yeah,
yeah.
So I mean, the ones I've worked on myself, like the one in Camden. And Camden, by the way, yes, it's in London, rich city, but actually it's a microcosm of the world. We have, the knowledge economy. So my university, University College London, the Wellcome Trust, British Library, British Museum, the Crick Center, the Turing Institute. This is like the knowledge corridor, right? The best the 21st century has to offer, on the back of, literally side by side, Somerstown, one of the poorest boroughs, just filled with all sorts of different types of inequality or symptoms of that inequality and the kind of social and economic determinants of inequality and health. that people like Michael Marmot, but also Wilkinson and Pickett talk about, that's a microcosm of what's happening in the world. So the missions in Camden have been really, really interesting. They're super local. I already mentioned the one around the clean growth strategy, which was focused on 10 housing estates, social housing projects in America, where the key point was not only the obvious, which is the physical infrastructure, greening it. That's kind of obvious what should be done, and us economists should admit when we don't know what we're talking about in terms of the actual details of the technology. But the bigger issue of what does it mean to have a green strategy locally that is truly kind of participatory, especially in an area where people really feel left behind. You know, the benefits of globalization, technology, and so on, as we know, went to not exactly the entire population. So what does it mean to both co-create in the way that I talked about, bringing those citizen assemblies and resident associations to the table in the first place to talk about what is a sustainable growth strategy here? What does it mean to live together more sustainably? But also to transform the institutions locally. So with COVID-19, and I'm sure all these issues are huge globally, especially in the developing countries, with COVID-19, a lot of people, began to starve actually. A lot of school meals, the only healthy meal that a lot of kids were getting, they were no longer getting during lockdown. We actually needed a footballer who worked, Marcus Rashford, a hero in the Manchester team, to lobby government to make sure that kids on free school meals continued to get them during the lockdown. But what Camden did was further to that. They said, yes, but we also, in the spirit of bringing agency, to the table, like people's empowerment, they said, instead of just having food banks, let's do food cooperatives, right? So that institutional innovation, the social innovation, instead of just a handout, and of course we should hand out food if people are hungry, no, of course, but at the same time, transform it into something that gives people self-worth. And if you look at the knife crime issue I talked about before, underlying that is self-hate. People who haven't been valued. It's much easier to stab someone if your own life is kind of like whatever, right? So working on self-worth and confidence, but also empowerment, education, knowledge, training, again, all the things that people like Amartya Sen have always talked about in terms of key capabilities underlying our opportunities. I've been much more inspired at that local level. It'd be interesting to look at, I know, Rwanda, for example, has a really interesting plastic-free mission. You literally land in Kigali airport and have to leave your duty-free plastic bag on the plane. They don't want you to bring it, off the plane. They've also brought families into that in terms of some kind of celebratory experiences that families together do in terms of picking up plastic off the street. But instead of thinking of that as like a tokenistic act, truly, what does that mean to bring citizens into something like a plastic-free national and then local street level? And I think Sweden, again, that I mentioned, they have a lot of sorry, that's my delivery coming, but hopefully someone will open the door. Street level missions. And I mentioned already their school meal mission, which is very interesting because it's super local, but the street level missions in Paris, in Stockholm, and also increasingly other countries that are trying to really just focus on the person during your day, from when you wake up to when you go to bed. What do you have access to? And especially people from different social economic backgrounds. We know there's food poverty in London, depending where you live, what's accessible to you. Those I think are super interesting to learn from and to scale them up globally, especially in countries that have even more inequality.
Yeah, well, we are almost running out of time. Maybe we can take one last question. Leonardo Souza has asked 3 or 4 questions, so I'll give the floor to you. Leonardo, you're there?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. Well, this question, I know we have little time, so this question is to Mariana. And I want to ask her, if do public officers consider they also need de-risking strategies to change their own institutions in order that mission-oriented strategies could work as a new collective trajectory never taken before? Perhaps change is needed for all the actors, including officers, and their own rules of the game. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's an extremely good point, and I like how you phrased it. I've saved the chat, by the way. I'm sure we can all do it because a lot of the questions are fascinating. So, this is, I mentioned we have a whole curriculum, or we're trying to build a global curriculum, even though our master's we're starting small because we want to give attention to the students, but the new curriculum we're writing to replace public choice theory and new public management is really because actually it's not only that market failure theory is problematic, but that new public management has actually convinced many civil servants that government failure is even worse than market failure. So take up as little space as you can, fix that market, then get out of the way. And how dare you try to direct an economy in the way we're talking about, or how dare you take risks because you might fail and government's not supposed to fail. So that kind of risk taking versus de-risking kind of approach, which is very different in terms of the mindset, the confidence, but the skills needed, because it starts to then ask big questions around portfolios, risk reward, or what does risk taking even mean from a public sector civil service side versus a venture capital side. And, I think there's lots to learn. Like, we should always remember, we shouldn't reinvent the rules. Yozma, public venture capital fund in Israel, thought, well, I used to speak actually to Avi Hassan, was that his name? I can't remember. The chief scientific officer, it's coming. Anyway, in Israel about these issues. And he would always say to me, Mariana, yeah, come on. Obviously we're doing what you're saying. Just shut up. Don't tell them. Let us pretend we're fixing markets so no one will bother us. This is what Fred Locke wrote about when he talked about the hidden developmental state in his wonderful book with Mark Keller. That what's interesting is the U.S., or how Eric Reinert talks about it, which I quote him in The Entrepreneurial State, the U.S. talks Jefferson but acts Hamilton. Well, fine, but first of all, that's, come out of the closet. Let's also talk Hamilton, especially because by talking about it, you then learn what works, what doesn't, because none of this is about glorifying the state. It's actually about learning what works, what doesn't. So you have Harvard Business School that is famous for its MBA, Master's in Business Administration, all these funky courses like decision sciences, strategic management, organizational behavior, thinking out of the box, rejuvenating the mature corporation, and the case study methodology they have on businesses has been shared across business schools globally. Why? Because if you accept that business creates value, of course you're going to want to get your hands dirty on what works, what doesn't, looking deep dive into the cases of what happened in particular businesses. Because we've dismissed the state as at best fixing markets or fixing innovation failures or system failures, we haven't done those deep dives into different state-owned enterprises, different innovation agencies, different digital agencies. Like the infodemic of COVID revealed that these governments have no clue about how to also use data, govern data, or even when they do, they might not do it in the public interest. What are the capabilities needed to do that? Who's doing it well? Who's doing it bad? What can we learn? This is the report I mentioned that my institute co-wrote with UNDP on the public sector capacity. What happened in Kerala? What happened in Vietnam? Why did that not happen in some other countries? What did we learn about the investments they had made on the back of other viruses like the Nipah virus in building trust with citizens, or that digital governance issue? I could go on and on, but it's all about admitting that all of this is about experimentation and taking risks, and that requires investments within the civil service to even think like that. And it's not about glorification. It's actually about holding also our states accountable to these issues of, common good, public good outcomes.
Okay, so even if we would like to keep Mariana for long, I don't think we can. So what we would do is we will send you all the questions. We have saved the chat, but we also have a long list from like private messages and stuff. And thank you so much, Mariana. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And thank you so much, Giovanni. And our next In Conversation series will be on the 21st of March with Erika and Rafael Kapinski. The more details will be on the website, and we'll all send you also reminders so you can expect our spam mail soon. And thank you so much. We all missed the social dinner, especially with all interesting people here, Mariana, Giovanni, but unfortunately we can have that. And thanks also to Luke, Maria, And Carlota, you have been extremely kind, and even after all the pestering emails that you've received in the past weeks.
Thanks to you. Thank you to you. No, really, thank you to you and all the organizers to have pestered us.
Okay, so
You
we'll
did a
keep
great
pestering
job.
in the coming ways and hope to
Thank
see
you.
you sometime soon. Yeah.
Thank you all very
Hugs,
much. This is
everyone.
so great.
Thank you,
Many
guys.
hugs, everyone.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao,
Thanks
ciao.
to you all.
Thanks a lot.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Oh wait, we should have done a screenshot. Oh well, I'm sure someone.
Well, I'm sure some of us have some of the organizers.
Should we do one? And we can make a puzzle. Do you know how you can actually send them to these shops and then make a puzzle, like a big 1,000-piece puzzle?
Oh, I didn't know that. But yeah, we can. Rajesh, can you do some screenshots?
I have done some screenshot, but I don't know. I'm not technically fit.
Okay, I do that.
Yeah, people, please open your cameras.
Yeah,
everyone
Nandita,
open your camera.
Before parting, can you please announce our next event? Can you please make an announcement of the next event, please?
I did that. So on 21st of March, we have the next In Conversation series with Rafael Kaplinski and Erika
Who's here with
Kamerula.
us?
And
Hi,
you
Erika.
have more updates on the website. Yeah.
Okay, good. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you soon, physically. Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao. Ciao. That's it.
Bye-bye.